Hi, and welcome back to Amped Up Radio. This week we have one of my favorite professors at Cornell, Professor Nick Admussen. He is an associate professor of Chinese literature and culture, focusing on 20th and 21st centuries. He also has a 4.7 rating on Rate My Professor. Um,
Woohoo!
Most recently, he translated Foral Mother Hua de Di by Ya Shi. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you. I did not know my rate my professor rating. Thanks for promoting the courses, the success of the courses. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's a really, really high rating, I'm
I
gonna
do not.
say.
I love praise, but I do not trust that website. I don't know, because I feel like there's might be a minority of students who are just like super into one or another thing who might be like filling out multiple forms.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the reverse is also true. I don't know. As anonymous ratings, I'm always a little worried. I'm glad it went well, but I wouldn't naturally expect it to go well for every faculty member. Um, but yeah, I'm glad. Good, and I'm so glad that you like the courses. I'm really that praise matters a lot. That you like it.
Speaking of the class, so I took Getting Rich in Modern China with you last semester. And I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but the course title was ridiculously misleading. Okay, so Getting Rich in Modern China, going into the class, maybe it was a mistake on my part because maybe I didn't read the course description thoroughly. Um, there was no investment advice. You gave us zero advice on how to climb the corporate ladder in China. But I think it was exactly what I needed during COVID because so throughout the course we basically read a lot of stories on female factory workers in Dongguan, a Dream of Ding Village, Rickshaw Boys. So stories that had to do with suffering and compassion and empathy. So I think it all works out in the end, despite the misleading course title.
It's a bit of a bait and switch. I will grant you that. It's not being rich in modern China because I guess probably the difference is it's probably my fault and not yours. Probably the difference is that when I look at the population, I think of almost all of the things that you would think of as a like a college student who's well off in either country. How do I get a good job? How do I make sure that I get a solid retirement? How do I buy property? Those are all sort of questions for people that are already rich. People who are getting rich have questions like, who can I trust? How do I overcome suffering? How do I deal with traumas that I carried from having grown up poor? The stuff that people, how do I face threats that I don't always understand, like the people in Dream of Ding Village do. And so that stuff is the sort of struggle of getting rich rather than the struggle of being rich, which is two separate things. But your experience is normal for students of the class. It's a little bit of a bait and switch. And I apologize for that. I had a student on the last day of class at which, you and lots of your classmates are like, you get this scam, right? You understand that you've been sort of scammed. You chose not to drop the class. Everything went well. But I have absolutely had people day trading on the last, almost performatively trading stocks on the last day of class just to be sort of like, I'm actually getting rich right now. I don't know what you guys think you're doing, but so it's a bit of a struggle, but it's a lot of fun, and I get to see a different kind of student than if I had made a class that was like poetry of suffering. That group of people I love, but I don't. I like to see other kinds of students too.
How did the rest of the students in the class reacted to, like Dream of Ding Village especially was a really heavy read.
Hmm.
Just like, I forgot what decade it was in China, but basically like selling your blood.
Hmm.
Um was it also your plasma? Basically trying to
Yep.
make a living, trying to survive. That to me
Mhm.
was I was really shocked by that.
Yeah, and I of course plasma centers exist in the U.S. There's one I don't know if you know about in Ithaca, the jungle, which is a sort of semi-formal encampment of homeless people or imperfectly homed people. And there's a plasma donation center right there, just a couple of blocks away. So this is something that poor people do all over the world to make ends meet. And um, what the other students, one of the things that happens for some students, I think, is that they kind of change their footing. So many people come in with this sort of aggressive, like, I'm in an Ivy, like, I'm going to do it right. I can do it right. I have the resources to do it right. And the class kind of slows them down and gives them the chance to ask what is doing it right, and to kind of unload the pressure of feeling like you have to do it right, to sort of accept that, maybe I don't end up with that, nice $70,000 starting salary job. Maybe I don't get an internship this summer. Maybe I don't. Maybe the economy goes. Maybe I chose the wrong major and I'm just stuck for a little while. And to sort of rethink about that as being a livable situation and a common situation, I think it releases a little bit of tension. Yeah, and so it's people empathize. I mean, they actually feel like it's hard, that they can tap into things that are hard in their own lives. Um, so that's when it works. And then some students are like, "Oh man, I guess I'll take 3 humanities credit. I'm just going to take the credits and run." Like that happens too, which is fine.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point that you bring up because, oh, we forgot to mention that you're also my advisor for the Asian
That's true.
Studies major.
That's
And
right.
during our first encounter, when I walked into your office, one of the biggest questions I had was just, hanging down on my head was, what do I do with an
Mm.
Asian Studies major? And I was really stressed out because, a lot of my friends were doing banking, that 70K starting salary that you talked about. And I also have like this one friend who asked, should I go for those prestigious and high paying jobs, whatever they are, and aim for the stars? Or should I settle for a relaxing life where I enjoy every moment I'm living in?
Mm.
So I think like taking that course kind of gives some sort of perspective in, this challenge that me and a lot of my friends face.
The reason I wrote the course in the first place was I actually had a student, a very good student, who was in another one of my courses. Uh, and she took a minor, I think, in Asian studies. I can't remember, but we corresponded after. I wrote her a recommendation letter or something, and she ended up in a job with Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company, the transnational oil company, and they posted her in somewhere ridiculously beautiful like Omsk, somewhere in northern Europe. She was sort of multilingual Asian diaspora person, but she got to go to this sort of way north place and like do China stuff in this like idyllic setting, and so she did it, and she went, and she sent me an email like a month in and said, "I didn't understand. This is miserable. We're constantly under investigation by the governments, and so we're all in depositions all the time. Nobody trusts each other. There are no friends here. Not just do I not have any friends, but there are no friends in this situation. Like it's extractive." And she was like, "I knew this, but I didn't know that it would feel like that every single day." Um, and I was surprised too. So this wasn't something that I was like, aha, like capitalism is bad. I hadn't been putting those pieces together early on. I thought maybe she would like it. Um, but so it was an idea to sort of expand the idea of the economy into a question of culture, and an economic culture about how you interact with people. Because the university culture, you're right, is kind of like, go get that, rap musicians would say, go get your paper, right? It's like, go get your money, like go do it. There's that assumption. And it's right for some people and not right for other people. And even if that is what you want, knowing that it's what you want in a way that you've thought it through is better, I think. Even if you decide to sort of, okay, I'm going to investment banking and think tank stuff is going to be exactly what I do. Um, so I'm glad you thought it through a little bit, regardless of what you decide. I hope it was worthwhile.
What framework would you suggest like, students my age approach just trying to figure this whole thing out. Because for me, at least, there was this period where it felt like I had an existential crisis like every single
Mhm.
week.
You're a fast learner, so that's a lot of you jam the crises together. You get through a lot more of them. Um, yeah, well, so the way I sometimes think of it is that of course, you need to learn skills in college, and of course, um, that's a big part of the day to day work. So I think of it as like focus on some skills like reading, writing, obviously, or math or whatever, some things that are just concrete things that you're practicing that you're getting better and better at as you go. And that's just sort of uncomplicated. You put in the time, you think it through, you do your biology, you do whatever, right? But I also think that there's this other space that like it's just hard, like increasingly sometimes it just feels harder to reach where you're thinking in an open way about possibilities and also outcomes, right? Um, and you're thinking outside of the surety of clear steps. And it feels like a crisis, and especially if you're not used to it, I think it feels like a crisis, because there's that lack of control over your future that you're kind of forced to cope with, and the lack of a sense of concrete meaning for the actions that you take. And that's something that I think is also it's a skill as well. You can get better at weathering the question of what do my actions mean, right? You can get better at that. um, but it's a separate kind of learning, and it doesn't necessarily happen in the times when you're also figuring out like how to write an essay or how to take a test. I'm really hired to give skills in Chinese and English composition and literary analysis and all that, but I hope to also have lots of space for this other thing, so that you have the crises in a place where it's not going to kill you. You can have a crisis and then wake up and go to food service for breakfast, and it's like not so bad. you know, um, uh, it's much harder to have these like you're my age and it's like you're 40 something and I don't know if anything I'm doing means anything, right? If you've never done that before, then you're really susceptible at that age to magical thinking and all sorts of other kinds of problems.
Back when you were in college in Washington University in St. Louis, you were doing
Mhm,
poetry writing.
mhm.
Did you ever face anything similar, or were you dead set that, okay, this is something I'm going to be doing? This is me now.
Yeah.
This is my life.
Yeah, I had a very different ethic. It was the 1990s, which in the United States, it was Kurt Cobain time, and the assumption among my friends and in my even in my intellectual circles was kind of like, this is a dead end that we're doing because we want to do it, right? It was an advocate. We were thinking in terms of avocation, which is to say the thing that you want to do with your life versus profession, right? Or vocation, like the thing you get paid for. And so I graduated from college and worked in a mail sorting plant on the second shift. So you start at 9 p.m. and you go to, or 8 p.m. and you go to past midnight. Um, and that seemed normal. I went to China because it was cheap. I could get a job there, and I could pay my rent, or I get you get a house, you get an apartment stuff. So the my expectations were extremely low, and that helped a lot to give me intellectual space to decide what I wanted to do step by step instead of having a big plan. Um, but that was also the 1990s. We had that ethic. Even my friends who were engineers or who had what I think of as pretty stable job prospects and were focusing on, a sort of life that looked like you could sort of predict it or see it. Even they were acting like it's everything's broken and it's no big deal. You know, we just had that sort of cultural ethic at the time. So it's hard to now is a different time. We were actually and geez, we were under so much less threat than your generation is. So the idea that you could screw around and still be fine and survive, I think, was much more appealing to us at the time. So I really sympathize with what people your age are going through because it's an uncertain time and it's a very difficult time, and it's a difficult time to feel like you can explore because it's a lot of scary stuff's happening all at once. So I don't know if my survivor bias of like, this worked for me, it's really going to work for you guys, but I think you'll find your own way. I mean, that's something I've been encouraged by, is to just to see the amount of like inventiveness and kind of commitment that you guys have, and you're so competent and organized and focused in some ways. The students that I meet from your generation, that I feel optimistic, even though the challenges are great. I think.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a different time
Hmm.
we're living in. Back when, you were at the mail sorting place, were you writing poetry
Yeah,
or learning Chinese?
I was taking a break from Chinese. I had done a couple of years of China. It was the summer, and I was going to go to China in the fall to teach and study a little bit more. Which is another difference. Is I actually had a little bit of money to pay tuition in the PRC. Um, I had saved up a little bit over the course of the college education. So yeah, I was taking a break from Chinese. I was writing poetry. I guess I was writing song lyrics because I couldn't write anything down, so I needed to remember stuff. So I was writing song lyrics that in that particular job, which were horrible, but a lot of fun to work on. But yeah, and honestly, in my life, if I had had a better sense of narrative, I would have probably continually been working on Chinese. I lost a lot of time and space when I wasn't working on Chinese. I lost a lot of proficiency when I wasn't working on Chinese. I let it lapse for a long time, long time, studying poetry mostly. So, and I might do that differently. I find sometimes I find myself frustrated with like, I could have done this in, like I could have accomplished this thing that I want to accomplish in 2006 because I was really good at Chinese then. Um, but you always have to make trade-offs, I guess.
If you could go back in time and say all of the Chinese that you've learned, you could get it all back, and you're basically an expert at the language. You've nailed it. You've mastered it. What would you have been doing?
It's it's a really good question. I wonder. I met a German professor at a meet and greet thing. Just one of these uncomfortable things where you're standing around with a cup of tea, and she,
Just standing there awkwardly.
yeah, just like, and there's nothing, and there's nothing really to. I don't have anything in common necessarily with these people, but we were just chatting, and I mentioned my anxiety and regret about my Chinese level, which is getting sharper as I spend more time at Cornell because I have a small child, so I don't travel as much as I used to, and so I don't have that kind of daily practice in all parts of my life. And I mentioned that to her, and she said, "Well, I'm not German. I'm a professor of German, but I'm not German." She was from somewhere else, and a third place, not an English speaking country and not a German speaking country. And she said, I have my German. I'm the person who has the German that I have, and that has value regardless of its perfectness in terms of how a very objective minded person might assess it in terms of its comparison to high German, like fancy high German. And that changed my opinions a lot because when I think about the sorts of people in the PRC who say, I speak perfect Mandarin, right? My Mandarin is perfect, right? I often question those people, not that they don't have good Mandarin, but just like, what's the value of that? So you speak like they speak in Harbin, but what's that good for? A lot of the people I'm interested in, they were dialect speakers. They're, intellectually interested in. They speak Cantonese. They're coming to Mandarin Chinese from another direction. And they speak with an accent, or they speak in their own way. Or they speak slang. They're young and they speak slang. So it's, being outside of the university system reminds me that like there's lots of different Chineses. So I don't know what it would be like if I was perfectly producing ideal phonemes at every opportunity. It might not be better than what I'm able to do now. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Which isn't to say don't study Chinese. I know you're taking Chinese class next semester. It's useful. I mean, I'm glad that I studied it. I would take those skills if I could have them for free. But I do more as I get older. I'm more cognizant that there are more people moving into and out of the language from more direction, and that's actually good. That's actually interesting.
What's your approach to learning Chinese, like as a professor now?
Mm, mm. That's a really good question. Now I try to read as much as I can. I always think of uh, reading as a virtuous thing. It's strange because I'm really incentivized to write, and I'm supposed to be writing a lot, and I'm supposed to be talking a lot. So I try to focus on reading as much as possible. And that, I think, because my pronunciation is okay enough that if I read a word and learn it from reading, I can use it later. So that's the way I'm getting it at this point. Earlier on, I think what I got used to when I was doing well was both drilling, and so like drilling vocabulary and pronunciations and tones and really getting them down, and then using it at the same time. So having a place where it was coming in and a place where it was going out. So I was doing both types of practice. The other thing that helps a lot is teaching, which is weird, but I'm never so precise about tones as when I'm teaching somebody how to say something. So that's been actually really useful as well.
So when you read Chinese, is this poetry or novels?
Right now, I mean, I read almost no novels. I do read poetry, and I read secondary criticism as well and news. But the book that I'm reading right now is actually also by Yanliang Ke, who we read in that class. He wrote a book called, what is it? 沉默与呼吸, Silence and Breath, or maybe Breath and Silence. I can't remember now. And it's a series of speeches he gave inside the United States about Chinese freedom of speech in China, and sort of 言论自由, right? Speech rights and how they impact literature. It's very interesting. It's published in Taiwan, so I have to read it up to down, which I always find frustrating. But it's an interesting book. So I end up reading stuff like that for research purposes a lot, or books that argue about poetry. Basically, is a common a common theme. But it's neat. It's one of the nice things about being a poetry scholar is it's quite encompassing. So you get the language of art, you get the language of description, in there mixed in with this other analytical language that's more technical, honestly. So it does help me read other stuff if I want to read other stuff. When I read the news, my news reading gets better and better.
Speaking of poetry, I'm going to be completely frank. So, me and my friends, I think like back in high school and we had to do like AP Lit, we had this huge disinclination towards the poetry section. Like, even when I took creative writing at Cornell last year, we did prose and poetry. And poetry was like, my
Mhm.
least favorite topic. Why do you think this is the case? And is there a way for us to change our attitude towards this?
I mean, I don't think it's necessary. I think you love the art that you love, and that's normal. I can't finish a television show. These long form television shows like I used to watch. I watched like what it was called, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a long time ago, and I got into it for a little while. And then at some point I just ceased. I think Game of Thrones probably did me in for just being like, I can't watch if it's more than 3 episodes. I'm just not watching it. Like I just can't invest anymore. So, and that's fine. I don't think there's any, even though that's, it's a big part of contemporary culture, I don't think you have to participate in all parts of it at the same time. The thing that I think there's two things that I think people who do end up reading a lot of poetry, I think that they have in common. One is an interest, or even like maybe a belief in the math of language, the technique of language. And so engineers often, math students, lawyers, a lot of times get into it because they believe that language has this, almost concrete power, right? And as such, you should study it just like you might study a molecule or anything else. So you get a poem and you just dress it down. You sit there with it for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And if it doesn't seem clear to you, you pursue that. I had a poetry teacher in college who was, as a child, had loved codes. And so he had all these code books. He's a little nerd kid with all of his codes. And you can see how that grows up into a sort of poet who speaks in other terms, right? That's one thing that I think is probably shared through people who put a lot of time into poetry. The other thing is, I think, I don't know, I guess when I meet poetry people, even the ones that are very experimental, I think there's a bit of the sort of romantic spirit in it. The idea that you're reaching for some sort of transcendental thing, whether that's religious or social, that it kind of attracts believers. I'm always frustrated by how many of my poet friends are into astrology. Uh,
No way.
I just No, that like the astro poets. I know this. There's a poet who I really admire who runs a Twitter account called Astro Poets, and they do like poetic astrology readings, and it's very popular. And there's it's because it's a big there's a big overlap, right, between those two communities, and it's legitimate. I'm not criticizing it. I'm not like that because I read Lu Xun and all this early 20th century modern stuff as well. So I'm sort of a realist in some ways, but I do think it's normal for those two traditions to kind of overlap. I certainly started writing poetry when I was much more religious when I was younger, and that was part of it, I think. And just the idea that your words are reaching for something bigger than the words could possibly say. Fiction builds worlds that cohere, and I think poetry builds worlds that point outside of structure in some ways. So that's something else I think people have in common. But those are just subjective things that people are ways that people are. It's not better or worse to like poetry, I don't think. Um,
Just now, I think it's really, really cool that you bring up the astrology part because I know that through the work that you do in poetry, you also write of climate change and also public health and healthcare. So
hmm.
I just find it really fascinating that you're able to draw, within so many disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, my writing on climate change and my old stuff on which I'm surprised you even dug up about healthcare reform is that's amateur stuff. One of the great things about poetry research, honestly, is that it's not capitalized, right? So like nobody sells a million books of poetry. There are very few people who are just professional poets and they just hang out and do poetry and that's how they make money. Almost everybody who does poetry has another job, whether it's teaching. A lot of people are teachers. A lot of the most famous poets are teachers, teaching or consulting other people about the poetry they want to write, or they run a press, or they're in public relations or something else. So everybody's almost sort of all the time a little bit of an amateur because it's not like there's no journeyman workaday poet who's like writing poetry for money. And so it kind of opens your attitude. Like when I see something in another field that I'm interested in, I can be like, well, I'll just take a stab at it. I'm not a professional, so that's fine. And writing about climate change, I think that was one of the situations where that just made a lot of sense. I could write something very short, very structured, right? And not sort of groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but just something that I felt that I thought was important. And I could just write it and send it out and put it on the web. If I felt more like a professional, I think I would have felt like I had to put more time into something like that. And then that would have been hard because it would have traded off with other things that I am a professional in. And that would have been a big, am I going to enter this field? I'm putting air quotes around. Am I going to enter the conversation in a authoritative way? I would have been like, no, that's a bad idea. I'm never going to be able to contribute in an enormous way to that. But if I just do my little part, as an amateur, that's okay. So, and I think that spirit is something that poetry people all over the world, especially in China, just do it yourself. Just go write a book of poems and go photocopy it and hand it to 10 friends, 20 friends. It's a sort of that's the first step. That's how you sort of become a poet. There's no real other way to do it in the PRC. So that's a great. I like that spirit, and it's one of the reasons I love this podcast is because you're just jumping in, like you're doing all this fascinating work, like from scratch, like you just like you figured out how to do it. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you so much. Just now, you mentioned the PRC, and one of the topics that I'm really fascinated by is that of censorship and propaganda in the PRC.
Mhm.
Is there a way of working around that as a poet? Do you have to conform with what the state wants you to write? Do you have some freedom at all in expressing yourself?
You mean as a Chinese poet?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very complicated. The general structure that existed for a long time, and things always change, so everything's always changing, and so this isn't an authoritative answer to the question. But for a long time, there was a sort of an implicit structure that lots of people understood, where if you have a very large audience, you have to stick to the message, right? You can say very little. If you have a very small audience, you can say lots, right? So if you're talking in your house around your kitchen table, you can say whatever you want, right? You won't get in trouble for that. But if you're in a daily major newspaper, well, you have to be pretty careful about what you say and what you don't say and how you say it and who you're talking to and all that. There are exceptions to that structure. So in the same way that poets in the United States and in China are amateurs because they're not making a huge amount of money and they don't have huge audiences because most people don't like poetry. That's that creates a lot of space for certain kinds of cultural production, and it encourages the kinds of small salon coterie groups that I think are really generative. We visualize being a poet as being a person with an audience, and we don't think appropriately about the scale of that audience. You need like 10 people to be a poet, right? To circulate your poetry, to discuss it, to feel like you're writing for somebody, and to have that sort of feedback loop of like people talking back to you. That's all you need. When you don't feel like you have access to a national publication, or you don't feel like you have access to, power and wealth and fame with your poetry, you focus on those 10 people in a totally different way.
Hmm.
I went to Huaining County in Anhui to go see the grave of Haizi, this poet that I was interested in, famous poet that I was interested in. And I met the Huaining County poets, and I hung out with them. And they do things like the guy I remember, the guy I talked to the most was he was like a medium haul delivery driver. So he would drive like 80, 90 miles with a little hatchback stuffed with goods and it like didn't have air conditioning, and it was just, he was like a worker. He worked. You know how they do this stuff to foreigners, and sometimes you walk into a building and everybody's like, oh, the guest is here and all this. I went to that guy's job site and they were like, can you hold this? Like, here, carry that over there. 'Cause they were really working. They did not notice that I was not from town, which you've seen me. It's hard not to notice, but they were really, he's a worker. And he has, 20, 40 people who are interested in his poetry, maybe more, maybe 100. And it's more than enough, right? He's challenging himself, he's pushing himself, he writes better, it's something more interesting every year. And I felt like that's just a different scale than we visualize, especially at somewhere like Cornell, where it's like, oh, if you're going to be a capital P poet, you need to go do a big thing, like you need to go viral, right? That's not true. You can live your whole life writing poetry for the people around you, about the people around you. And actually a lot of the great poets that we know, that's how they did it, that's how they started, was for their people, the people that they cared about. Long story short, there's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can say in the PRC. The government is not omnipotent, and it chooses not to enforce certain kinds of rules and preferences in certain places at certain times. So there's a lot of space, I think.
Do you think, based
Yeah.
on the stories or the poems rather that we read in class, I think it was Northern Girls, so
Hmm.
female
Which is a
factory workers.
mhm. So Northern Girls was a novel by Sheng Ke, and then we read a selection of poems called Iron Moon about workers writing poetry sort of at the end of their shift.
Just by writing these poems, do you think there would be some sort of change or reform that would take place?
Yeah, I have a graduate student who's kind of working on that question right now. Um, whether workers' poetry and the poetry of factory workers, or fiction by factory workers, or turns into a sort of worker identity, a worker movement, a union, these sorts of things, and what the relationship between those two things is. That's probably outside of my pay grade. I don't really know. um, I do know that it has happened before, that art and poetry and fiction and film have been important in changing people's cultural practice and the way that they interact with one another. So I think it's possible, but I honestly have no idea about this particular situation and the future for this. In part because events are accelerating so rapidly that it just feels so difficult to predict that even the near future. One of the strange things about the course was we were studying work at a time when China's factories were shutting down, and the cult, what's because of COVID. And so what happened to those communities and what they did with that time when they weren't working, and how they felt about being forced to work in some situations, and how they felt about being denied work in some situations, that's still not clear. I still don't know what's happened to workers in Guangdong province in the last year. I don't know. I gotta, we're still figuring it out. It takes time and effort to sort of realize what's really happening. So that complicates the question of workers' poetry a whole lot. And the next complication is coming, I think, in the near future. I don't know what it is yet.